Hello everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at the disputed questions on the mystery of the Trinity, Question 1, Faith and Knowledge, Article 1, Whether the Existence of God is an Indubitable Truth, by St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure, who's that? He's a doctor of the church, the seraphic doctor, actually also the patron saint of abnormal bowel movements. Because of a condition he had as a child. He was a contemporary and friend of St. Thomas Aquinas. They actually competed once in a songwriting contest for the hymns to be sung in adoration. Unfortunately, Bonaventure lost. He was also a genius, though he's not read or talked about as much as other scholastics. He wrote many very systematic treatises. And, he's on top of it. I mentioned some of this in my last video, but there is a specific format to the disputed questions, which is what we're going to be looking at today. So the disputed questions format would take place in some sort of conference hall where a master would expound a question and talk about his solution to the question. And then he would take questions and defend his position from attacks from the audience. Later on, he would recreate the important points and edit them for publication. Now, it wouldn't always be the master himself who recreated and edited everything. It would often be some sort of scribe who was listening and taking notes on the conversation. And then afterward, they would turn these debates or these public disputations into articles for their disputed questions. Okay. Article 1. Whether the existence of God is an indubitable truth. Arguments in agreement. The first two sections of the argument in agreement are arguments that are more or less arguments from reason or creation, whereas the third section is ontological arguments, so arguments from knowledge of the terms. Okay. Arguments 4, Part 1. Bonaventure has many arguments from authority that he proposes, all of which depend on the authority of one or another person, such as St. Augustine or St. John of Damascus. I have elected not to include these arguments because I find them uninteresting, at least for present purposes. 2. The desire for the good is implanted in the human mind. Desire follows upon knowledge. Therefore, there is knowledge of the good in the human mind. God is the good. Therefore, there is knowledge of God. And then 3. The image of God is present in the human mind, knowledge and love. Knowledge of being in the image of God includes the knowledge of God, so you have knowledge of God simply by knowing yourself as being in his image. 4, it would be inappropriate for a person to have a noble habit without knowledge of it. The knowledge of God is the most noble habit, therefore it would be inappropriate for humans to have no knowledge of it at all. I should note that a lot of these arguments I find at least mildly confusing or hard to support, though some of them I think could be defended in various ways. So just keep that in mind. These are more like, as far as I'm concerned at least, sketches of arguments which should be developed at great length, and more like suggestions. And I think some of them are more serious than others. Okay. 5. All men desire happiness. Happiness is found in God. Men can only desire what they know in some way. Therefore, at least in some way, men know God. This is an argument you'll find in Peter Craif's book, The Best Things in Life, though he comes to knowledge of God at the end of the argument about happiness, not at the beginning. 6. All men desire peace. Peace is only found in immutable eternity. Men only desire what they know. Therefore, men have some knowledge of a being in immutable eternity. This next one's a little bit weird. It says that God has self-knowledge, and we are similar to God. Therefore, we have knowledge of God. So because God has knowledge of himself, and we are like God, we have knowledge of God. Now, my first inclination would be to say that maybe we just have knowledge of ourselves through similarity to God. But I think what Bonaventure is getting at here is that because we are similar to God and we know ourselves through our similarity, we also know that we are similar to God through knowing ourselves. Okay. Arguments 4, Part 2. If there is posterior being, then there is prior being. The conjunction of all posterior beings includes the existence of at least one prior being as first principle. This is a basic contingency argument which would be run by, every philosopher from eternity past to eternity future. It basically says that you take these contingent things that didn't have to exist, you load them all together into a single category and say like, oh, well, they all need a cause, and they can't cause themselves, so there has to be something from which they come. And Bonaventure is going to want to say that this is God. 2. If something has existence from another, then there must be at least one being who has existence from no other. However, there are things which exist from another, therefore, there is at least one being who exists from no other. If God is possible, then he exists of necessity. God is possible, therefore he exists necessarily. Nice little modal ontological argument. If there exists relative being, then there also exists necessary being. There is relative being, therefore, etc. Now, I don't know what he means by relative being. I guess maybe he means like... My guess would be that he means like some sort of contingent being and not like relations as such, but maybe he genuinely just means if there are relations, then there is a necessary being. I guess I would fail to see the entailment, but that's one of the arguments. If qualified being exists or is intelligible in any way, then absolute being exists. Qualified being does exist, therefore absolute being exists. If there is a being that exists because of another, there is also a being that exists because of itself. Otherwise, nothing would be good. There is a being which exists because of another, so there must be a being which exists from itself. Only God could exist from himself, so there is at least one existing God. There's a citation to Boethius that I'm interested in tracking down at some point. I would be really fascinated to see if someone could support the premise that if a being exists because of another, then there must be something which exists because of itself. If there is composite being, then there is simple being. There is composite being, therefore there is simple being. Simple being is God, therefore God exists. This is just a simple dependency argument, very common for Neoplatonists. Very cool, I like it. Next, if there is changeable being, then there is unchangeable being, for all motion comes from beings at rest and moves towards a resting place. There is changeable being, therefore there is unchangeable being, which is God. If there is an accidental being, then there is an essential being. Only God could have essential being. There is accidental being, therefore God exists. Accidental being doesn't mean accidents like color or extension or something like that. Accidental being here just means a being which doesn't essentially exist. So God exists of his essence, so he's essential being, but we don't exist of our essences. We only exist because something causes us to exist. So we're not essential being. That's what he means here, not like color or extension or quantity or something like that. Then we have the last part of the arguments 4. These ones all have the same structure. They're essentially ontological arguments. They will say that some truths are known through understanding the terms. God is one such truth. Therefore, just understanding the term God will give you knowledge that he exists. Arguments 4. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. That which can be thought of as non-existent is lesser than that which cannot be thought of as non-existent. Therefore, God cannot be thought not to exist. It's the old Anselmian argument. That nature which only exists in the mind is not as great as that nature which exists also in reality. But, God is the greatest possible thing, so he also exists in reality. No truth can be seen except through the first truth, but God is the first truth, so things can only be known through God. God is the first truth in reality and in knowledge. First principles are impossible to be thought to be false. This is what makes them first. Therefore, it is impossible to think that God does not exist. 5. No proposition can be more true than an immediate inference from a true proposition. The existence of God is an immediate inference from knowing the concept, therefore it is true. The idea that God exists is tautological because existence is included in the definition. Then we have the objections to thinking that God exists. Objection 1. The fool has said in his heart that there is no God. But to say in one's heart is to think, therefore it is possible to think that God does not exist. Damascene says that the pernicious evil of human nature has prevailed to such an extent that it has led some men to the most irrational and most evil abyss of perdition, of saying that there is no God, so at least evil men can believe that there is no God. 1 Corinthians 8 says that an idol is nothing. If you think God is an idol, then you think he does not exist. It is possible to think that God is an idol, so it is possible to think that he does not exist. 4. Whatever can be signified can be thought. It can be signified that God does not exist, so he does not exist. If you can prove the existence of God just from the terms of greatness, then you can also prove that there is a greatest possible island. There is no perfect island, therefore there is no God. 6. In what sense is it impossible to think, because it can obviously be thought in some way that God does not exist? We can hold nothing more certainly than the faith. However, the faith can be doubted. So, other things which are less certain than the faith can also be doubted, which includes the existence of God. Things which are hidden can be doubted. God is hidden, so he can be doubted. There is doubt about things inferior to the soul, but there is more doubt about things superior to the soul. God is superior to the soul, so there is greater doubt about him than there is about inferior things, such as matter. God is simple. It is possible to doubt that God is just, so it is possible to doubt whether God exists. This is actually my favorite argument here. If God is simple, if God is a single property, which is simultaneously omnipotence and perfect justice and perfect mercy and pure existence, then all of his attributes are the same object, outside the mind. However, God is just, but you can doubt that God is just. This is the entire idea of the problem of evil, is to say either God is not just, or he does not exist, or he is not all-powerful. So people can obviously doubt that God is just, but on a view of divine simplicity, God not only is just, but his justice is his existence. So if you can doubt that God is just, you can doubt that he exists. 5. It is pointless to prove something which cannot be doubted. Saints and doctors have attempted to prove the existence of God, so God's existence can be doubted. 6. No one knows what God is, but in God, essence and existence are identical, so no one knows whether God exists. 7. If disbelief in God was impossible, then believing in him would not be meritorious. It is meritorious, therefore, it is possible to think that God does not exist. Then we have conclusions, the actual opinion of St. Bonaventure. He says there are two kinds of doubt. Doubt on the part of the reasoning process and doubt on the part of the reason itself. Doubt on the part of the process will say that there is evidence lacking in itself, demonstration, or the intellect is incapable of knowing. None of these are present in the case of God's existence, and there is knowledge of God innate by being in the image of God. So he says that we have certainty. We have certainty through our innate knowledge, through being his image. We have certainty through demonstration, which comes from the perfectibility of beings. There are beings which are perfectible, and the only way they can be perfectible is through a perfect being, which would be God. And there is certainty from the terms involved. Simply by knowing or understanding the idea of God, we also know that he exists. And then he talks about the kinds of doubt which are possible, because it is possible to have doubts, but they are all easily removable, at least according to Bonaventure. One is the act of apprehension. This is the act of the mind whereby we understand a term. When you see a blue thing and you receive the idea of the blue into your mind, then you have gone through an act of simple apprehension of blueness. So he's saying that maybe you just don't know what the term signifies. You haven't properly apprehended it. Next, there is in the act of judging. This is the act of adding a copula. So you say, God is something which exists, or the chair is blue. So the is there is the copula. You can also have is not. The chair is not blue. So in the act of judging, you could have partial knowledge, and this could lead you to attach the incorrect copula to God exists or God does not exist. He also has a passing mention of the problem of evil as a reason some people have for not believing in the existence of God in the process of the act of judging. Then there is in the act of reason. This is a failure to believe the conclusions of premises which a person believes. So Bonaventure seems to think that everyone believes premises which entail the existence of God, but that they fail to follow through onto the conclusions of their premises, and in this way they fail to believe in God. So he actually lists 3 ways to doubt or disbelieve the existence of God, but that he says they are all essentially just deficiencies in the person's intellect. Now we have the reply to the objections. I've only actually added a couple of the replies in here because most of them are obviously understandable from the main text, and they also are just super uninteresting. The first is the one about idolatry. You can fail to think that idols exist because idols by definition don't exist. People think that God is an idol, so they think he can fail to exist. Well, the Gentiles think that the God of the Christians is an idol. Now, Bonaventure says this is because they fail to fully comprehend him. Next, on the ontological argument, this is the talk of the greatest possible being, but also the greatest possible island. Bonaventure says that the ontological argument talks about a greatest possible nature, not just a greatest possible member of a specific nature. So, there isn't really a greatest possible island, but there's a greatest possible kind of being. You have humans, you have rocks, you have cats. The ontological argument isn't aiming at a greatest possible member of a species. It's aiming at the greatest possible species simpliciter. To the argument about God's existence being hidden, it simply is not, according to Bonaventure. Everyone knows it, even just through the terms. On the argument about humans barely knowing lower truths and thus not being able to comprehend properly higher truths, he says that all higher truths are implicitly included in lower truths. So if you know something of a lower truth, then you necessarily know something of God. On the argument about the arguments from previous Christians that God exists, he says that these are not proofs but exercises. There's no need to prove the existence of God. These are simply an exercise in reason. And then finally, belief in God itself is not meritorious, as the demons do it. It's only meritorious in certain circumstances. I hope you've learned something. Have a nice day.